Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Turning Readers into Writers. And today I am interviewing a fantastic young lady called Jess DuBose. And she is a life coach, particularly for women who are struggling with relationships, because she too went through a very difficult time in her relationship. And the outcome of that was she wrote a book called Why I Don't Hate My Ex-Husband. And so I wanted to chat to her about what prompted this transition from doing coaching into writing, and also ask her about the process, what she enjoyed, and whether or not she would do it again. So let's dive in today and hear what she has to say. Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining me. You know, I just wanted to let you know about a very special event I am holding throughout the month of August. It is a special 20-day event called Author Accelerator. And it's especially for you if you are a beginner writer, because I am inviting in to talk to me a whole heap of experts, whether it be a how to write type book, or whether it be how to get in the right frame of mind, or whether it be how to build your confidence and reduce that imposter syndrome. I've got experts coming in to chat to you about all sorts of things. So head on over to my Facebook group, Turning Readers into Writers, and join in the fun, which will be happening throughout August for our August Author Accelerator. Great. I can't wait to see you there. Bye-bye. Well, hello, Jess. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really, really thrilled to have you here. Just before we get into the questions, I just want to let the audience know a little bit more about you. So Jess DuBose is an expert space holder. And through her business, Coaching with Jess, she helps women who struggle with relationships to connect deeply with themselves so that they can step into their power and stand in the highest versions of themselves. Jess has helped dozens of women grow in their self-love, to understand their worth, create boundaries, and hold the vision for their dreams, and lots more. Jess is a certified Big Leap coach through the Hendricks Institute, and attending several seminars on relationships, play, and self-development. They've all molded Jess's style of coaching. She has also been influenced by the works of Brené Brown, Glennon Doyle, and Preston Smiles, just to name a few. And Jess is really a personal development junkie. So if you ask her for a book recommendation, she's probably going to give you 3. Jess is a coach for Kaboom Coaching, where she serves coaches on their journeys to growing their businesses. And she also creates personalized meditations and edits content and books for her colleagues. Jess's highest value is growth, and she strives to grow each and every day. And above all, Jess emulates love. So welcome indeed, Jess. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
And certainly your desire to kind of always be growing and so spreading the word of love is definitely sort of encapsulated within your book, your new book that you have released. So well done for that. I was just looking on Amazon today and I saw that you are number 48 in the US Amazon store in your category. So congratulations. That's fantastic news.
That is fantastic news.
So I wonder if you could just start by telling us a little bit about how you got into writing.
Yeah, I fought being a writer, quite honestly. It is not something I necessarily identified with, but I really always have been a writer. I have journals from the time I was 10 until I was 17. I wrote in a journal every single day. And then, wrote papers in high school and college, and I have started a blog, and, I was writing newsletters for different companies that I worked for. And so really, I've been a writer for a really long time. I just didn't identify as one. And in my book, I even have a chapter titled I'm Not a Writer. And I talk about the arguments I would have with my ex-husband about not being a writer. And he was like, you are a writer. And I would argue with him, and I'd be crying because it was like this identity thing where I was like, I don't no, I'm not a writer. And so, I've gone through this whole process. And then when I got, while I was writing this book, I was still fighting that, honestly. And I was listening to a podcast by Brene Brown, who was interviewing Glennon Doyle, and they were talking about their writing process. And I completely resonated with everything they were saying. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a writer. Because I recognized that I identified with the writing process of Brene Brown and Glennon Doyle, who are people that I adore. And so it was just this really beautiful moment.
I think that is something that a lot of new writers have trouble stepping into, is that label of writer and describing themselves as a writer. And I think, just as you say, once you kind of own that title and say it enough times, it stops being a big dream and it becomes a reality, and you start to believe it. And then that can have a big impact on how you go forward with your writing. Now, I've just realised that we haven't mentioned the title of your book and what it's about. Do you want to tell us a little something about it?
Yeah, it's called I Don't Hate My Ex-Husband. And it's really my epic love story. Like, it's still an epic love story, whether we're together or not, it really is. And my journey through grief, and then my path to self-love. Because while I was married, I didn't love myself. And so journeying through my divorce and afterward, I really learned to love myself. And so it's got all kinds of beautiful stories of, learning to love myself, understanding the arguments that we used to have, and now how, with a different mindset, how I look at them very differently, and just like looking at things from a different side. But really it's just like that journey through all of it.
Love hearing the fact that it's still a love story with your husband, even though you've since divorced. I think it says a lot about the compassion in both of you, and how you can still love somebody, but perhaps it's just not meant to be for the long term. But you mentioned there that it's sort of helped evolve a journey of sort of self-discovery, and self-love was the term that you used. And I believe it's sort of from that your coaching business came about. Have I got that the right way around?
Kind of. While we were married, I was looking at going back to school for counseling, because when I was in middle school and high school, I got asked all the time, like, are you going to go to school for counseling? And I was like, no, I don't want to get paid for that. But then I really understood that I really do love helping people. But it wasn't until after we divorced that I learned about coaching. I didn't know it was a profession. I didn't know what it was. And then my best friend, like, was doing a program with the Hendricks Institute, and she's like, I think they have a coaching program. So I learned about it. They were having a seminar 3 weeks later, and I was like, I have to go. And I made sure I got there, even though it was across the country.
So you started doing your coaching, and then so you're doing your learning, and then you've started your own business. So how did you manage starting a new business, being your own boss, and then also managing your time to write? How did that work out for you?
Yeah, so I started writing this book probably a year and a half ago. I actually wrote the introduction and sent it to my ex-husband and said, hey, like, I want to write this book. What do you think? Because my goal through the whole thing was to make sure I honored him, because it's not just my story to tell. He was like, yeah, go ahead and write it. And so I was starting to work on it a little bit before I even had started my business. But it wasn't like I jumped fully into my business in February of 2020. And then in about March, I had a colleague give me lit a fire under my butt a little bit to be like, when do you actually want to get this done? And I was like, well, I really want to have this, like, I want to launch my book June 23rd, because I'm very nostalgic, and I wanted, that would have been our 7-year anniversary had we been together still. And so I was like, yeah, I want to get it done June 23rd. And then I did the timeline backwards and recognized, I was like, oh no, that means I have to finish it like right now. Because there's the editing, and there's I didn't know what I didn't know about publishing. And I also recognized that before, like, I would start to look at the publishing stuff as a way to avoid actually writing the book. So, yeah.
Yeah,
And
procrastination. Yeah,
yes.
resonate with that 100%. Yes.
So I was like, I told myself I was not allowed to look at the publication process until I had finished the book. So I didn't know what I didn't know about the timeline of that. So I was like trying to give myself enough space where I could still hit my deadline. So it was a lot of like very intentional time of writing. So I was doing my business and writing. And so I was working a lot during that time, because I was like determined to finish my book and hit my deadline. And honestly, like it didn't take me as long to write that I thought it would, because, I had been thinking about this book for a year and a half. Most of it was already written in my head. So it was just a matter of like putting it down and writing it and like actually like forcing myself to take the time to do it. So I didn't necessarily.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, did you handwrite it or on a computer, or did you dictate the book?
I did a computer.
Okay.
Yeah, I was typing on the computer. And I also used stuff that I had written while we were married. So like I had journal entries or like emails that I sent to people, or poems I had written, and I kind of put it like all together. So sometimes it was doing some research too. Like I have this app called Marco Polo, which is a video messaging app. And so to really dig back into like the most difficult parts of our divorce, I was going back to those messages that with my best friend, like where I was crying and really upset and like getting like, okay, what was I saying then? Because I'm obviously in a different place now where I'm, I have gone through a lot of healing. But so I just went back and would do some research on that too. Mm-hmm. I remember I got really stuck on one of the chapters. I have a chapter called Anger. And I decided while we were married and figuring out if we were ending or not, like that's like the hardest part about divorce. And it's like, I don't know if this is over or not. There's no actual conclusion. It's like turmoil is like crazy. So I had written, as a way to like move through my anger, I had written a letter to Morris, my ex, that was never meant to be seen by him. The only person I ever sent it to was my best friend. Like it was never meant to be seen by anybody. And I was like, I have to put this letter in this book, because like that is part of the process. Like that is part of, but I was like, oh my gosh, no one was supposed to see this. This is crazy. Like I was so angry, like, oh, and I don't feel that way anymore. How do I even put this chapter together? Because like it starts off with, F you and da, 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 and I was like, I don't even know. So I spent a lot of time on that chapter, really trying to like, how do I honor him? And then I was, I didn't really have writer's block or anything like that. I just was scared. Mm-hmm. So I allowed my fear to make me stuck for like a week on that chapter. But I spent some good time with colleagues talking about it. Like I know a lot of coaches at this point, so they helped me hold space with me and like hold up a mirror and help me move through my fear. And
that eventually I got a cathartic chapter to write. So any residual anger or embarrassment or just self-consciousness about it, that must have been a great way of letting that go and putting it out into the world and asking for forgiveness, I suppose. And so I'm wondering, with the time that you allocated to do your writing, did you have an objective for each session? Some of us maybe say, okay, we're going to allocate an hour to do this, or it might be that you have a word count that you want to hit on a certain writing session. Was that something that you kind of accounted for, or did you just kind of do it as it came, as the muse came?
Yeah, it depends on where I was. So in the writing process, at the beginning, I just allowed it. When it came, I would just start writing, because I knew that in that moment, like I was like, oh, this needs to come out right now, or I'm going to forget it. Sometimes I would do voice messages, or like send a Marco Polo to a friend if I was like driving or something and I couldn't write, just so that I wouldn't lose the idea, or I would take notes. I had a notepad in my phone, and I would take notes and be like, oh, this would be a great chapter. And I didn't need to necessarily write it then, but I was like, oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, and at least write the idea down. So at the beginning, it was a lot of that. When it would come to me, I would write. When I felt like the chapter was in my mind, I would write it. And I actually had no idea how I was going to structure the book when I first started. Like, none, no idea whatsoever. So I was just like, oh, that's a good idea. That's a good idea for a chapter. That's a good idea for a chapter. It wasn't until this past December that I actually had a breakthrough with understanding how I wanted to weave the chapters together. I actually really enjoy writing letters to myself and to other people. And so I weaved letters in between the chapters to myself, like my past self, past ex-husband, my readers. I even personified grief in a chapter and wrote a letter to grief. And so that was really fun for me to play with once I had that idea. So yeah, it was, yeah. And then when I got to that timeline where I had a very short timeline of like March to like the end of April, I would just sit down every day and write as much as I could. And I would at least want to knock out one chapter as I was sitting there, and do as much as I could to like get all of my ideas down for that chapter. And then the next day I would look at it again and just do some editing, because oftentimes when I'm just sitting in the middle of it, you don't like, I didn't necessarily see like all of the stuff. I'm like, ooh, that was terrible. Let me do that again.
I'm so impressed with your setting a deadline and working backwards. It's certainly something that I teach as well, as the idea of giving yourself an end date. Otherwise, it can just go on and on and on and on, and you continue to procrastinate and never get it finished. So I'm really impressed by that, and it's something to any of our listeners, it's something I really encourage, because again, it gives that feeling of just like claiming the word writer. By giving yourself a deadline like an editor would in the traditional publishing world, it gives you that feeling of being a professional and having a job to do. And that in itself can be quite motivating and kind of, as you say, get you going and make sure that you put the hours in and get the words down. So you mentioned that you...
And
Sorry, go on.
Once you've actually made a decision to do something, there's something that shifts in your brain too. And that's some of the coaching stuff, but that's the same thing in coaching. It's like a lot of the times people are waffling between like, I don't know if I want to do this or not. But once you actually make a decision, like, no, I'm going to do this and I want to have it done by this time, there's something, time expands and allows you to give you that kind of space to be able to do it.
I like that, time expands. Yeah, it does. Yeah. You mentioned just beforehand that you weren't sure how to structure the book or plan the book out. So it sounds like from what you were saying, rather than sit down at the beginning and think, okay, this is how I'm going to write the book, it just came organically. And you mentioned an epiphany about when it kind of all sort of slotted into place. Was that the use of the letters, or was that something else?
Yeah, it was the use of the letters, because I had I would do a chapter on anger and a chapter on, the dishwasher and how we filled it differently and how it drove me crazy, but how it wasn't wrong, it was just different. And I'd do a chapter on a time where he called me a Disney villain and how I felt about that. Or, I'd have these like stories that come to my mind, and I it was just like this hodgepodge. Like, some of them were written very funnily, some of them were written, and I was like, how do you even put a book together where there's all these different ways of writing? But this is just how I am. And rather than continuing to think, well, this is not how books are, and like compare myself, like, it doesn't matter. I get to, like, it's my book, so I get to do whatever I want with it. And so I was like, but I just didn't know how to weave them together, because it was like, okay, there's a little bit of a timeline, sort of, but like, I even have a chapter called grocery shopping where I lapse time between different conversations of grocery shopping and wondering why we never grocery shop together anymore. And it's like, oh, it's because of this, this, and this, the conversations we would have. And so like, I would take a topic and kind of time lapse. So it was like, okay, so I can't really just do this in chronological order, but there is a little bit of chronological order because I have like our proposal and the wedding and there's some timeline to it, but outside of that, I was like, I don't know how to put this together. So then when I came up with the idea of the letters, I was like, oh, I can kind of weave the chapters together by putting letters in between. And some of the poems that I have written over the years, I really enjoy poetry as well. And so, yeah, I kind of just broke up the book that way. I also, for a little while, I was judging myself on how short my chapters were because I don't really like to write lengthy things. That's why they're kind of separate. Like little short stories is kind of what it is, but overall it became a book. So it was like, yeah, that the interweaving the letters was like a huge breaking point. But it took, like almost a year before I even got to that point. And so I just would write and write and write. And I was like, someday this will come together. And it did.
And it did, yeah. Yeah, I think that is often how stories, even, whether it be memoir or fiction, the sort of storyline of the characters, whether they be real characters or fictional, they kind of mull around in our brains for quite a while before we start putting pen to paper or start trying to plot it out. And I think we sort of need that little bit of, oh, I lost you there.
Yeah.
Got you back. Phew. Yeah, we sort of need that little bit of time to assimilate the characters and the storyline and what it all means in our heads for a while before we start to plot it all out. Or if you're like me, I don't do any plotting either. Discovery write and just kind of start telling the story and see what happens. But yeah, we need to let it rummage around in our brain for a while to make a bit of sense of it, don't we? Yeah. So this was your first book.
Yes.
A lot of fiction authors, particularly, I think, they worry a lot about not being good enough and that feeling of imposter syndrome that often crops up. Did you experience any of that, or did you kind of, through your coaching work and the work you've done on yourself and your personal development, did that sort of counter any feelings of not belonging or imposter syndrome?
Oh, for sure. Like, even though I've done a lot of coaching work and self-development and learned to love myself and recognize that I don't need to judge it or, but it still comes up because like I get to practice that all the time. I get to practice my self-talk. I get to practice not putting judgments on my thoughts and actions and stuff like that. And so that imposter syndrome would pop up all the time. Like, I'm not a writer. That was still a conversation when I was writing the book, right? I have a whole chapter on it. And I would put so much judgment on, like, these chapters are so short. This writing doesn't go well together. Like, who am I to write a book? Who's going to read my book? But at the end of the day, like, the thing that I just kept coming back to was like, this is for me. Like, I'm writing this book for me. Because I had even my best friend read it for me and gave me a bunch of notes. And she's like, what's the through line? Who is this for? And I was like, me. It doesn't matter. Like, people will read it or they won't. They might get value from it. They might not. But like, at the end of the day, like, this needs to be me. And I don't have to have a through line. I don't have to have X, Y, and Z just because other authors of the past have done it this way or other coaches have written books this way. Like, none of that matters. I'm a very creative human being and I get to play with this however I want to. And there was some notes that I took. I got to a place where I was actually able to take some constructive criticism, because when I was married, that was actually a source of contention. Like, that was part of the writing process. My ex-husband's actually a published author also. So I always viewed him as the writer, not me. There was a lot of comparison happening.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay. Oh, that's quite okay. So you probably felt it even more then than if there was not another writer in the house. But when we spoke yesterday, you did mention that, in fact, he was the one that was said to you, no, you are a writer. And you were the one who was like, no, I'm not, which I thought was so lovely to hear, because I know quite often people who don't have, there are a lot of people whose friends and families don't understand what they do and kind of describe it as being a waste of time, and that really plays into their limiting beliefs about themselves and make them question what they're doing. So it's really interesting that even with having spousal support for it and someone saying you are a writer, even with your self-development work that you've done and are doing, you still kind of have these recurring themes of self-doubt. And I think that's reassuring for our listeners, that it doesn't matter what stage you're at, it doesn't matter what you do for a living, or, you know, it's got to come from within. And you kind of, sorry, I probably interrupted you there, but you were sort of saying that you got to that part eventually with support, where you did have that self-belief.
But even as I was published, like hitting the button on Amazon to publish it, I got scared. Like I actually was doing it on a Facebook Live, because I was kind of showing people my process. And so I was like, oh, I'll do this on a live Facebook post. And I like paused and I was like, oh, I'm scared. Like, because, my soul is in this book. I talk about anger and sex and grief and like everything. Is like, and even if you're doing like a fiction book, it's like your baby, right? Like you've created this thing, and there's something so beautiful about creation, but it's also really hard to share it, because then you're like, there's a point where I might get judged or criticism or all this other stuff. And I was like, oh, I'm scared. But then I was like, courage. I have a tattoo on my wrist that says brave. Like, being brave is not the absence of it, it's like doing it anyways. And so just continuing to remind myself, like, it's okay that I'm scared, let's do it anyways.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Being brave doesn't mean an absence of fear. Absolutely. You've got to kind of face that fear and do it anyway, haven't you? I don't know who it was that said that, but I say it to myself a lot. And so do you have any plans for another book in the future?
Yes. At this point, I want to do some content stuff for coaching. And so I'm mulling around the idea of like a breakup journal and a befriending grief journal for people who have lost loved ones to suicide. So I have a couple ideas about journals, and I have different ideas already popping up about other books too. Like, it's amazing. It's hilarious to me at this point that I didn't think of myself as a writer. And, sometimes I still catch myself in that space of like, oh, I'm not a writer. No, like I have ideas for writing all the time. Like, I am a writer. This is what a writer is. So yes, I absolutely do have plans for other books.
Oh, I'm good. Because I'm glad. We can't have enough writers in the world, and it's so good that it hasn't put you off. That's fantastic. Well, listen, thanks so much. Before we go, I would love for you to tell the listeners where they can find out a little bit more about you, and particularly about your coaching. So where can they find your book? Where can they find you on social media? And where can they find out about your coaching?
Yeah, my book, I Don't Hate My Ex-Husband, is on Amazon. Or you can go to my website, coachingwithjess.net, and you can find stuff about books, my book, and coaching. I even have book recommendations on that page as well. And then I do a lot of free content on my YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. So Facebook, my page is Coaching with Jess, and then Instagram at Coaching with Jess. So if you remember Coaching with Jess, you'll be able to find me.
We'll find you. That's great. Oh, well, lovely. Thank you so much for coming on today. I love the fact that, you've been through this kind of journey yourself of not being a writer, then being a writer, getting your book out there. I think it's really inspirational when people kind of take life by, what's the word I'm looking at? Take life by the balls, I guess it is, and go for it and just see what happens. And as you said, it's for you. You were writing this for you. And I would encourage kind of all my listeners out there who are feeling fearful about what other people will think about their work. But remember, you're doing this for you primarily, and any other readers, that's a bonus. That's a bonus. Well, lovely. Thank you, Jess. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye. Well, I hope you found that fascinating. I certainly did. I always love talking to new writers to find out what inspires them, what makes them take that final decision to say, yes, I'm ready to write my book, to learn about how they go through the process themselves and that voyage of self-discovery that we go through as writers. Now, don't forget to come on over to my Facebook group, Turning Readers into Writers, because in there we have useful information and education. We have live Q&As, and we also have guest speakers coming in on a regular basis. So go on over to Turning Readers into Writers on Facebook, and in there you'll also find my free guide, 3 Secret Hacks to Writing with Consistency. I hope to see you in there. Take care.